Hello, and welcome back to AP Environmental Science. Today, we want to talk a little bit about dams. And when we talk about generation of power, we're talking about hydroelectric power. But dams have been used for lots of things over a very long period of time. We've been building dams to divert water for, thousands of years. So we're going to talk a little bit about dams in general, and then of course when we're talking about energy, we're going to focus on the hydroelectric component, the actual power plants that are inside dams. But I want you to keep in mind that dams are used for all kinds of things. But first, the first thing I want to show you is this, if it will come up, there we go, figure that shows the primary energy consumption in the U.S. and it's by source, so how do we generate that power, the energy, and by sector, what is it used for. And I really like this one. We're going to come back to this over and over and over again, but I really like this one because it shows you what we're using and what we're using it for, and then how much. So we can see that petroleum, most of it is used for transportation, right? Natural gas, that's kind of evenly split among industrial, residential, and electric. Then we have coal, which is primarily used for electric. And then we have renewables, again, primarily used for electric, and nuclear, which is used exclusively for electric power. Okay. Now, I put this up here, and you'll notice that hydroelectric power is not on it at all. Hydroelectric power, while it is a conventional energy source, it is also a renewable energy source. And so if we shift over and start looking at just the renewables, right, we take that same bit of information that you just saw, and we say, okay, renewable energy is 9%. You can see that out of that, hydroelectric is 35%. And so what does that mean? What are we doing? Well, we are generating electricity with it. Okay. Now, on the plus side, since 2006, hydroelectric has actually become a smaller percentage of what we're talking about because all of these other sectors, with the exception of geothermal, have actually grown. And we'll talk about what we mean by biomass, wind, and then solar should be pretty obvious, but we'll talk about that too. So this is a good thing, and you can see that the overall amount of energy is much larger, and so that's a good thing. Now, getting back to dams, what do dams do? Okay, well, there are four big things that we use dams for, and that is preventing floods, providing drinking water, providing irrigation, and generating electricity. And we actually have over 45,000 dams in the world that are 50 feet tall or higher. Okay, and so we have basically dammed every major river. And as a matter of fact, we've gotten to the point, and we'll talk about this in just a second, where we've started taking away dams because we've diverted water so much that we just can't continue doing that, because in many cases it's actually unsustainable. But when we look at the overall picture, there are some clear benefits and clear costs of dams. And the benefits are great, and the disadvantages are huge. Okay, so this is just an overview, but let's actually look at it. So what are the advantages? Well, it's actually, you get a really moderate to high net energy production with a very high efficiency. And to give you comparison, coal is about 38% efficient. Hydroelectric is 80% efficient. That also means that it's pretty low cost because all you have to do is rely on the river flowing through the power plant. Has a very long lifespan provided it's built well, and you get that added benefit of flood control while you are generating electricity. There is no CO2 or pollutant emissions during the operation of the dam. You can turn it on or shut it off really quickly, right? Which is not true for, say, nuclear power plants. Those take time to spool up and shut down. Same thing for coal-fired power plants, right? You also have water, a reservoir that will give you water for year-round irrigation, and for cities, right, municipal water supplies. You can also dam rivers to make deeper channels so you can have transportation and shipping. And then, of course, you get a big old lake, which is a great recreational opportunity. Which brings us to our first question. Dams can lose more water than they provide. Well, that's an interesting statement. Okay. That statement is actually true. Even though you're damming the water to use it, the way the dam works actually can sometimes involve lots of evaporation, because instead of having that nice flow, you get this big, deep standing water, and you get lots and lots of evaporation off of the reservoirs and dams. And there are some other disadvantages too. High construction costs, they are tremendously expensive to build. Now, fortunately, we've pretty much built all the large dams that we can build, because like I said, everything's pretty much already dammed. There's a huge environmental impact that we'll talk about, but that includes flooding natural areas. It converts land habitat to lake habitat in that flooding, and so you get not just this flooding of the ecosystem, but you also get population displacement. People have to move, and large dams have actually displaced somewhere between 40 and 80 million people worldwide, most of whom were not actually officially resettled or given compensation. Their land was just flooded. Now, in the developed world, you are given compensation if you're going to have something happen to your land, but in the developing world, that is generally not true. So what else? Well, when you stop that water, you decrease the sediment flow, and so you don't get the nutrients to the rest of the river, like downstream. You're going to decrease the fish harvest because you've decreased the sediments, you've decreased the nutrients, which means you've changed the ecosystem and the plants that are going to grow, and you've limited the plants that can grow, so you've got fewer fish. You actually destroy the native fisheries because not only do you decrease the fish harvest, but you also stop fish migration. We're gonna talk about a bunch of these in just a second. It's going to change the water temperature above and below the dam. Above, you've got deeper, still water, okay? And so that's going to be colder water. Below, you've got shallower, less, a lot less water. And so it's going to be a lot warmer. The pHs are going to change because you've got these temperature changes. And then you're also going to have high CO2 emissions, not from a power plant. But remember, you've got this reservoir, and then you have the river downstream. And so as biomass builds up in the reservoir because you flooded all of these land areas, that's going to decay and emit CO2. Same thing on the downside, right? You've killed all this stuff. That's going to decay and emit all kinds of CO2. The other thing is, remember when I said these are great and have a long life if they're built well? But there's always the danger of collapse, even if they are built well. And when that happens, it is catastrophic if the dam is large. And you have a loss of recreational opportunities. You gained some because of the lake, but you lost all the river recreational opportunities, and that's a huge issue. Okay, so let's talk about some of these specific disadvantages in detail, and I want to start with the fisheries, right? And a really famous example is salmon in the Columbia River. So the salmon population in the Columbia River got really, really, really low because there are multiple dams that actually impede migration. And so they tried to do hatchery stuff where they would do aquaculture and raise the salmon and release them, and it really failed. Okay, so what they had to do was to build what are called fish ladders. They had to put in ways for the fish to actually cross the dam, successfully. Now, this is great, but it's not effective enough, and so there are now some plans to actually remove dams on the Columbia River to reinvigorate the salmon population. Okay, but just to give you an idea, a fish ladder is basically this nice little passage where the fish can go up into these little pools. In a way, it's like locks for fish, except they don't actually change. They don't close the door with the fish in them and let them go, although some of them do. But anyway, so you've got these little fish channels, okay, and it's a gentle slope, and then they go right up and then over, because they can flow over the dam. That's not the problem. It's coming back the other direction, okay. If you have a higher dam, you might have a fish lock, and this is what I was talking about. You actually do, in some cases, have locks, just like you have for boats. And then if you have the space, right, the best way, of course, is to make a fish little bypass that's another river, right? And so these guys can swim up this little river here, and they have a wonderful natural experience, and then they end up back in the big river at the top. This does not always work because you need the space, you need to have the ecosystem, and a lot of times you just don't have it. Now, what are some other options? Well, reservoir fisheries. And this is where you actually are raising the fish in the reservoir, and it's monitored. They release the little fry and fingerlings and all those, but this is baby fish. But it doesn't actually compensate for the lost river fisheries. And different fish need different environments. That doesn't work as well as it could. And then aquaculture is great, and there are lots of places where we're starting to use aquaculture to replace river fish, ocean fish, and as pressures on fisheries increase, aquaculture is going to be a growing thing. The problem is that there are added costs, there are different beneficiaries to the fish and to the profits and all of these things, and there is a large environmental impact depending on what you're doing and what you're growing. For salmon, they foul the waters they're in a lot, and we've actually talked about that when we talked about fisheries. Okay, so moving to the next thing, let's talk a little bit about the Glen Canyon Dam, right? The Glen Canyon Dam is a really good example of sediment issues in dams and reservoirs. And so because its regulated flow has prevented sediment from traveling downstream, it's actually changed the ecosystem in the Colorado River and Grand Canyon. So before dam construction, right, you have all these great sandbars and sediment, all this vegetation, and that's super duper. After the dam construction, it started to erode all of that and just take it away. And you got a thicker layer of sand on the floor, which was a problem for the benthic communities, and you didn't have these nice sandbars that would slow the water down and allow for nutrients to be distributed. And then, of course, regulated floods occur from time to time, and then you would have this sediment-laden water that was just flood the area, but it's moving fast, it's turbid, and essentially you lose all of the vegetation. Okay, now they've started to do these regular floods, these regulated floods on a fairly regular basis, because while you do get this fast water, it is sediment laden, and so you can actually start restoring some of that sedimentation. So here, after the dam construction, they've blocked the river, right, and it's just flowed a little bit, and it's fast and all this good stuff, so you lose vegetation. Then you have this regulated program where you flood the river periodically, so you restore the sediment, and then you can start to see the river take the shape that it had before, and that's nice. Okay, now moving on, maybe here. Okay, there we go. So one of the things that we're starting to do is remove dams. Some of the smaller dams are being removed. Now, there are a lot of people who actually want to get rid of larger dams. This can be a problem because these are used for water supplies for cities, for irrigation, electric power, and things like that. But on the plus side, so large dams probably won't be removed, but small dams really can be in a lot of cases. So dam removal, what is it good for? It restores the river, right? It reestablishes the fisheries, and you can go back to having some of that river recreation like rafting and fly fishing. Very exciting. Okay, now here's your question. Subsidies for renewable or alternate energy sources are criticized by opponents who label them as unfair and a burden upon consumers. Make the sources more competitive with energy production from fossil fuel. Could be compared to subsidies provided to fossil fuel producers, including government costs for cleaning up pollution and maintaining access to foreign oil, for allowing investment and research that should ultimately pay off when fossil fuel supplies dwindle, or all of the above. Well, a lot of alternates actually do have subsidies, and that can include hydroelectric projects, although not so much anymore since they're already built, but still. They are criticized by opponents who label them as unfair. However, fossil fuel companies do get subsidies, and that does include the cleanup for things, because it is the government, ultimately, most of the time, that pays to clean up. I mean, think about the Exxon Valdez. That is actually what happened there. And Exxon still has not paid for it. And it is the government that keeps shipping channels open and, maintaining relationships so we have access to foreign oil. Renewables, if you have more renewables, they become more competitive, right? And subsidies allow for research when they are used appropriately. Now, a lot of subsidies have been given out in the past few years, and they were not used appropriately, and things sort of went awry. But, like any other subsidy, if it's used well, it can pay off. Okay, so what are some major dam projects? We're going to quickly go through the dams that you should know. And the first one, of course, is the Hoover Dam. This is on the Colorado River. You should be pretty familiar with it. It's the one between Arizona and Nevada. It's in Black Canyon. And it was originally called Boulder Dam, but it's not. It's in Black Canyon, not Boulder Canyon, so there you go. This is the one that actually forms Lake Mead, which we've talked about before, and it supplies Arizona, Nevada, and California with both water and electricity. It produces enough power on a regular basis for 1.7 million homes. And of course, you've seen it before. So there you go. This is the reservoir above. This is the river below. And here's the dam itself. It's huge. Okay. Now, the Hoover Dam problems, it prevents sedimentation downstream, okay? And so it reduces soil fertility and it increases erosion. And rainbow trout that were introduced into the reservoir are actually an invasive species, and they're causing major damage to the ecosystem, and that has to do with those temperature changes. Rainbow trout do really, really well, and so they are stocked in that reservoir, but they are invasive. All right, second thing that we want to talk about is the James Bay Project in Canada. This is actually a series of dams, right? This is a bunch of dams together, and it's the diversion of 3 major rivers that flow into the Hudson Bay to generate electric power. And basically, there are 2 phases, phase 1 and phase 2, and they have dammed 9 rivers and flooded an area the size of Belgium, which looks something like this here. Yeah, and then of course here's one of the dams on one of the rivers. Okay, this has resulted in massive flooding. I mean, it flooded an area the size of Belgium. This flooded the native lands of the Cree Nation, most of them actually. And then the other problem is that mercury has leached out of the rocks and into the water, and it's been causing mercury poisoning in animals and nearby residents. And then of course animals suffered. But just to give you an idea, looking at large animals, 10,000 caribou drowned when this project was implemented, and they drowned during their migration because it actually blocks off their migration patterns, and that's just some of it. Okay, I'm just hitting the highlights of the disadvantages. And then the Aswan High Dam in Egypt. This is one of the largest embankment dams in the world. Oh, I've put little links to the different kinds of dams that you see here. This is on the Nile River, and it forms the world's 3rd largest reservoir, and that's Lake Nasser. And the conditions before the dam, you had the Nile flooding. I mean, this is really famous. It's been happening since the birth of civilization. We relied on the flood of the Nile yearly to make that area a good agricultural area and to grow things. And it's how Egypt got to be Egypt to begin with, right? Now, unfortunately, some years the river didn't rise, and that caused widespread drought and famine. So this was actually built in 1952 to control that flood, and it does, right? And so you can see that here's the dam itself. It's definitely flooded some areas, right? You can see this is the reservoir behind it. And then the dam holds the floodwater during the rainy season, preventing that massive flood, and then it can release it during droughts, right? But the water available is only half because of that evaporation issue, and it seeps into unlined canals, right? And so the Aswan High Dam actually loses lots and lots and lots of water, which is a downside, but it does generate half of Egypt's electricity, so that's great. It did relocate over 100,000 peasants who were not compensated properly. And the sediment restriction means that the farmers downstream have to use a whole lot more artificial fertilizer than they did before. And it's caused decline in fisheries in the Mediterranean because you don't have the nutrients flowing down all the way. And then the other thing is because you have this change in the ecosystem, there were these snails, right, that were the intermediate host for some schistosomes, which are responsible for a condition called schistosomiasis, and that is a waterborne infection. And so you had this epidemic where about 80% in some of these areas of people actually got sick with it. And so you can see that there are some huge problems with changing these ecosystems, and maybe things that are not anticipated. Okay, and then Three Gorges Dam in China is the largest dam in the world. And it is going to be your class activity, so you're going to know all about that. All right, if you have any questions in class, let me know, and thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.